All right, everyone. Very excited to have Paula Pant from Afford Anything and the Afford Anything podcast joining us on the show today. And we are going to be talking about the housing market. Is there a housing market crash incoming? And I have a feeling some of us are hoping that there is to some degree because of the level of panic that we feel or that we know that we have friends or neighbors or acquaintances that are feeling at the moment because the prices just seem to be going to the moon. And even more than that, the fact that in many cases, I have had friends tell me that they have put in offers many, many tens of thousands of dollars over asking, 60,000, 70,000, 100,000 over asking, and didn't even get a second look. Some of them are telling me that they're dropping, like they still want an inspection, but they won't actually say no to it, or they won't ask for any changes, or maybe they won't even ask for an inspection. Like it is apparently a seller's market. And that kind of makes some of us a little bit uneasy because it doesn't really feel sustainable. And to some degree, we don't even really understand why we knew we had to have Paula back on the show. She's done some deep research into this exact topic, and maybe we can pull this out and figure out, best practices on both sides from a seller's perspective and for a buyer's perspective. And then at the economic level, what does this mean for us as a society? So to help me with this, I have my co-host Brad here with me today. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, Jonathan, I am doing quite well. Yeah, we always love having Paula on the show, certainly. And this is a perfect time, right? Because as you said, there are many, many millions of people across the country right now facing what seems unprecedented, or if not unprecedented, then certainly not something we've seen since, the go-go years of probably 2006 to 2008 or thereabouts. And it just, like you said, it doesn't seem sustainable, but there's a lot of tactical information that I'm curious to dive into with Paula, both on the buyer side of, hey, it's easy to get caught up in this craziness and the euphoria of we have to have that house. But right, as you said, do you forego inspections? Do you keep putting in escalation clauses tens upon tens of thousands of dollars higher? But then on the seller side too, right? Like, hey, we just got 27 offers and they all have different things. I'm not a real estate professional. How do I parse this? So I think what we look at in the FI community is understanding the rules of the game and trying to see how do we move forward in the most intelligent way possible. And that's why we have Paula here. So Paula, welcome back to Choose FI.
Thank you so much for having me back on the show. I'm excited to talk to you about this topic that is on a lot of people's minds.
Well, let's start right there. So I kind of shared this, anonymized version of this friend of mine who's having a lot of pain as they look for a house. And by the way, not even in like a coastal hub, but in like Alabama, right? Like we're not just saying if you're in New York, it's going to be tough. If you're in Seattle, it's going to be tough. This is Alabama. And it's a hot market everywhere. Do you have anyone in your own personal life that's experiencing some of the angst of which I'm describing?
Yes, my parents, good old mom and dad. They are
wow.
80 years old, and they've been wanting to buy a house in the Tampa Clearwater area. They spent the pandemic holed up in Atlanta, and now having been stuck in their townhome in Atlanta for the last 14 months, they're like, get us out of here. We want something different. But of course, being 80, they're fully retired. They're living on a fixed income, fixed pension. They don't have the resources to compete with people in their 30s or 40s who have incomes and who have a little bit more flexibility than somebody in their 80s might. What they do have going for them is that they could pay cash. Like they can sell their home. They can they've got some of those funds, but they also for months now have been bidding against 15, 20, 30, up to 30 people on a given home in the suburbs outside of the Tampa area.
I want to interrupt you just to say that even a couple of years ago when I was making a bid on my current home, if I had to bid against one other person, I would have had a little bit of a sinking vent. Well, actually, it is a contested house. There's two other people that want the same property. And I was like, oh, I can't imagine what it would be like to know there's actually 30 offers in right now.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's I mean, you normalize to anything, I guess. Like once you've looked at a dozen houses and they all have, a couple dozen people interested in it, you sort of normalize to it and standardize to it and fine tune your thinking to understand that this is the reality. but it takes some getting used to. So they went under contract 2 days ago, as of the time that we're recording this. They finally got an offer in, got an offer accepted.
So Paula, I guess, well, first, my question is, did they come to you and ask any advice? I mean, you are a real estate expert to many, many hundreds of thousands of people. Like, did your own parents come and ask you questions?
Oh, yes, tons.
Okay.
In fact, they wanted me on the phone. They would do three-way calls between my dad and myself and his real estate agent. So they had me very, very involved in the process, the bidding process, designing what the offer was going to be, designing how much to offer, what kind of contingencies to include in the contract. I was very involved in that.
Okay. Well, that's cool. So I guess tell us more about those things specifically, and also like what might have been different as opposed to if they had come to you and asked for advice 2 years ago or 15 years ago, whatever it may be, right? Like as compared to a normal market. You said, sure, we can all normalize to this, right?
Mhm.
But it doesn't feel normal, right?
Yeah.
Like there's some unusual stuff going on out there. Like, and it's easy, like I said in the intro here, it's easy to get caught up in, oh, it's our dream house, regardless of whether you're 28 or 80, right? Like it's our dream house. We have to have that house. We, we'll waive everything. We'll offer 100,000 over asking price. But that might not be the most prudent decision, right? Like how did you advise them?
So there were a few things that I said. First of all, I want to focus on the notion of quote unquote over asking price, because that's something that I hear a lot of people talk about. Both of you have mentioned it in just the short few minutes that we've already been recording.
Yeah, I feel like I did something wrong. You caught me. What rookies?
No, it's all good. It's all good because what we know from the study of cognitive biases is that the asking price provides an anchor point. And our feelings about the price of a home depend on the price that home sells for relative to how we've anchored to it. But the asking price itself is simply two people's expression of what they think the home is worth. It's what the agent thinks it's worth, and then what the homeowner thinks it's worth. The agent and the homeowner get together. Usually the agent's going to recommend a particular price. The homeowner might say, let's make it a little more, let's make it a little less. And then between the two of them, they have a conversation about what the asking price should be. And that's what it is. And so if homes are selling for over asking price, that's not really information about anything in and of itself, other than the market is changing so quickly that many agents are mispricing homes. So my message to people who are listening is not to anchor on the asking price too much, and not to anchor on whether or not a home is selling over asking or how much over asking it's selling for. What matters ultimately is what can you afford as a buyer? Can you afford the home regardless of what the asking price was?
Well, maybe let me push back on that just a second. As a real estate investor, there's a lot of different ways that you appraise whether or not something is a good deal. But I feel like a lot of real estate investors say your money is made at the point of purchase, right? When you
Correct.
buy. And it sounds like, just based on the way that last sentence was phrased, you've kind of, ceded that argument entirely. And you're just saying, well, what can you afford? Which is a different
Right.
question.
Well, let's make a distinction between a primary residence versus an investment. If you're buying a primary residence, you're not looking at it as an investment. You're looking at it as a consumer purchase. And when you make any consumer purchase, whether it's a shirt or a pair of shoes or a house, it's, hey, is this in my budget? And is it in my budget? And that's the approach that you take for any type of consumer purchase, homes included. If you're an investor, then depending on whether you are flipping houses versus you're buying and holding, there's what I call the find through create continuum in terms of generating value for a property. So if you are the type of investor who is very aggressive about buying something for less than fair market value, meaning that you will get instant equity at the closing table, then what you want to pay close attention to are what are comparable properties selling for right now, and how can I buy something for 10% less or 20% less or 30% less than that? And so still, even if you are an investor, the asking price is still just an arbitrary number that you should never anchor to. What you would anchor to as an investor are comparable properties, like what are the neighborhood comps, and how can I get something at a discount relative to those comps?
As we're talking about making these sorts of decisions, what can I afford? And we're making obvious comparisons to maybe 2006, 2007, 2008. The other half of that is you might have been able to afford it, but are you buying at the peak? Because
Hmm.
if you can afford it now, but it turns out that 24 months from now, 12 months from now, the same house would have sold for 25 to 50% less. Regardless of your comfort level with that payment, you're going to feel a little bit frustrated. And so
Hmm.
I think that's kind of one of the reasons that while we want to talk about the tactics and strategies for identifying a home, and what you could kind of be a little bit less aggressive with in terms of you're going to make all these demands versus what you absolutely won't purchase a home without, it's probably going to be helpful for us to kind of understand how we got here or do our best to kind of assess that, to kind of give us a
Hmm.
framework for maybe I should just wait for 12 months and see what happens. Maybe I should just wait for 24 months. Maybe I should rent forever until this insanity stops. And I don't even know right now if we can objectively say that's a good strategy. It's just this is what people are having to go through to kind of consider.
Hmm. Absolutely. So that's a great question. Let's talk about the differences between 2006 versus 2021 and why they are in no way comparable. So in
Did I start this by saying the obvious comparisons? I love I love the reversal there.
Refuted again,
I will learn my lesson. I will learn my lesson. Go for it.
To put it very simply, in 2006, there was a housing surplus fueled by speculation. In 2021, there is a housing shortage. That's the major difference. Surplus then, shortage now. And so, beyond that, in 2006, you had, first of all, a higher percentage of homeowners had mortgages on their properties. Of the people who had mortgages on their properties, they had larger debt loads relative to the equity that they held on their property. The borrowers themselves had lower credit scores and were less qualified borrowers. There were a greater number of cash out refinances or second loans, and there were a higher number of delinquencies, slash, there were a lower number of on time payments. Right now, as compared to 2006, you have the opposite in every single one of those regards. As a percentage of all homeowners, fewer homeowners have mortgages on their home, meaning there's a greater percentage of homeowners who own their home free and clear. In part, that may be because of the graying of homeowners. You've got more baby boomers, they're retiring. If the I don't know what if the average age of homeowners has increased. I haven't checked that stat, but if it has, and I think it's reasonable to assume it has, then the idea that more homeowners would be owning their home free and clear makes sense with a graying of homeownership. Of the people who do have loans, those loans today are much smaller relative to the equity that they hold in the property, meaning homeowners who carry mortgages have higher equity loads. There are healthier debt to income ratios today. There are significantly fewer cash out refinances and second home loans, and there are lower delinquency rates slash more on time payment histories. So what we don't see right now is a debt bubble or a credit bubble in the way that we saw that in 2006. That's one of the reasons why this is not a 2006. And then the other reason is in 2006, you had a huge number of home builders building homes. You had a lot of new construction permits getting pulled. You had a lot of renovation permits getting pulled. Home values were rising so fast that builders were building in order to capitalize on that. Right now, that is not happening. There are a lot of builders who want to be building. Last night, I listened to 3 episodes of a podcast that's put out by the National Association of Home Builders, went just straight to the source. There are a lot of builders who would love to be building, but they are so worried about the cost of lumber, the cost of steel, and the cost of copper that they don't want to put their money on the line Even despite how much home prices have risen, it's still too much of a risk given the out of control material costs.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that was my next question. So, that's incredible information. Thank you. Thank you for that. And right, the housing shortage. Do we
Right.
have any sense of, so my question was going to be, is this because of the cost to build? Is it, I'm assuming just like everything, it's multifactorial, but like, what in your mind is causing the shortage? Is it a demographic thing, or people now have more money on hand? What is it that's causing this, and like where do we go from here, basically?
I mean, there are many factors that are causing it. One major factor is the cost of lumber right now. Lumber has at least quadrupled, perhaps more, and that is unusual. If you look at the cost of lumber over the span of the last 30 years, lumber's been, lumber does move a little bit in price. I mean, the number of home construction is much more dynamic. It can expand and contract as an industry far more quickly than something like lumber, where, with lumber, you have labor capacity and you have mechanical capacity. And both of those, particularly mechanical capacity, is hard to scale up or down quickly. And so you have, over the last 30 years, yes, there have been some fluctuations in that price, but they have lumber's relatively stayed within a predictable range. And if you think back to, like, let's say you were an investor in 1985 or 1990, 1995, would you be investing in a lumber mill or would you be investing in tech? Lumber, because of its high fixed overhead, because it requires many, many years and tens of millions of dollars to open a new lumber mill, it's very capital intensive. And it didn't, it had relatively lower profits, particularly compared to some of, industries like tech. It was not a field that attracted a lot of growth. It still isn't. And so you look at lumber today, the prices have skyrocketed, but it's very difficult. If an investor right now wanted to build additional capacity in order to meet that skyrocketing demand, it would take, even if a project was approved and shovel ready today, it would still be years before you could get that factory built and scaled up.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I wanted to go back to your point before about, the anchoring on home prices, because I think it is tied into. So what you're painting the picture of, hey, maybe this just is the market. Maybe there's not a bubble. This is supply and demand. This is a free market economy, and the prices have gone up, right? And
Right.
we talked about very specific tactics, right? So let's say for that home buyer, right? So okay, maybe sometimes that price, the initial asking price, is anchored based on comps or other things like that, and they have to deal with appraisal,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how much cash do you bring to the table? And I mean, there are many real important tactics that people need to understand. Like, how would you talk somebody through that, as far as the comps, the worry of it not appraising? Talk us through, like, how would you advise someone what to offer, how they can deal with that if, the appraisal doesn't come in, even though, like we said, supply and demand suggests, okay, this is the price, right? Someone's willing to pay it. But based on our system, if it gets appraised $70,000 less, well, you have an issue, right? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. So essentially advice for buyers, like how do you
Advice for
structure
buyers in that situation where housing prices are going up dramatically, and the structure of getting a loan is based on a system where that doesn't normally happen.
Right, right. So a few things. First, before I answer the question, I'll make a distinction between the asking price of a home and what it will appraise for.
Sure.
So the appraisal value that home will get once it's under contract and you bring an appraiser out there, might be completely different from whatever the asking price was. I certainly do not envy appraisers right now. I think they have a very difficult job at the moment, given how quickly the market is shifting. But to answer your question, in terms of advice for buyers, first and foremost, and I hope this is obvious to anyone who's listened to your show for some time, or either of our shows for some time, do not overextend yourself. Do not buy more house than you can afford, and do not rush into home buying prematurely as a result of FOMO, fear of missing out. None of those are good reasons to buy. So if you are, in terms of the rest of your life, if you are not in a financial position to buy a home, or if it would be too much of a stretch, if you would end up house poor, don't do it. So that's the first. I hope that's a duh statement, but
It's probably a duh, but you know what? I would be interested in all the
Mhm.
episodes that you've done. Is there, especially that second one that you mentioned? So we talked about FOMO and we talked about don't overextend. And then you actually said make sure you can afford it. I'm curious what your personal rule of thumb and the rule of thumb that the Afford Anything community generally has kind of in mind. What is that? How much you can afford? Is it based on take home pay? What's just your general, clearly general rule of thumb that you would say if you're going over this, you're going to feel the pinch?
That's, you know, okay, that's a good question. I don't like to give specific percentages because they can be a little too one size fits all. I mean, if you have uh, a child with a disability with high medical costs, you're going to be in a very different position than a couple with no kids who don't plan to ever have kids, right? If you're supporting a family overseas, or if you have a parent with Alzheimer's that you're supporting, right? You're going to be in a very different position. And so I don't like to give standardized, like quote unquote, rules of thumb. I would say instead to sit down and make an overall budget that includes every expense in your life, and then ask yourself, if you're a couple, ask yourself, all right, what if one of us lost our job, right? And we had to cover all of these other expenses with a job loss. What could we swing? If you're single, what if I lost my job? I had to live on an emergency fund for a little while. Maybe I have to take a different job with a 20% pay cut. What would I be able to swing? Like walk through some of those black swan events that would affect your own family budget or personal or household budget, and see where housing fits in the broader landscape of all of that.
Would you say in the context of identifying when you're starting to feel house poor, that if over 50% of your take home pay is going just to your mortgage, and then on top of that, you're going to have to cover taxes, transportation, so taxes, property taxes on your
Yeah.
home, transportation, food costs, bills, you're not going to have a whole lot left for savings. You're going to
Right,
probably
right.
feel like you're just making it to the next paycheck. So even if we weren't going to do a range, would you kind of in your mind say, yeah, 50% of your net pay is going towards
Yeah.
your mortgage? That's going to be rough.
I mean, I'd say even anything over 35% is too high.
Yeah.
But I don't want people to hear that and think, cool, that means up to 34.9% is okay.
Right. Okay, cool. No, that's legitimately helpful. I just kind of wanted, there is some number at which point everything else in your life is going to be more difficult. There is a cost to
Right.
getting your forever home. If your forever home puts you at a 50%, 50% of your net take home pay is going towards it. It will be your forever prison. So
Mm.
just kind of wanted to plant that seed there. You were building off of this. This was the duh part. We can move on. I just it's all yours.
So other advice for home buyers. Once you get into the swing of things, like once you start making offers on properties, be prepared to lose a bunch of offers. That's going to happen. I watched my parents go through it. I myself I bought a duplex in March of 2021. So both
Mm.
myself and my parents have now bought homes slash are under contract for homes in 2021. And I went through it too, just losing out on offer after offer after offer. Don't get discouraged by it. It's just part of the experience. In terms when making an offer, the price that you offer on a home is one of many factors that will influence the seller. Additional factors include number one, of course, if you can offer cash versus if you have a mortgage. And what that speaks to really is one of many examples of contingencies. And so contingencies are all of the things that are put into the contract that could allow the contract to blow itself up. So when I talk about cash versus a mortgage, that's an example of what's called a financing contingency, meaning that it's in the contract that um, if I can't get the financing, then I can terminate this agreement, right? If you're taking out a mortgage, you do definitely want a financing contingency. Don't waive that, but that's one of the things that a seller would look for. A home sale contingency is another example. So if you currently own a
Paul,
home,
before you go through these, as we go through each one, I just wanted to point out on that first one, there would be a possibility. So I'm just thinking, as we say, this is the thing to work through. So each time that presents us an opportunity to create an advantage for ourselves in our offer over someone else who would need a said contingency. Like for instance, with the first one you just mentioned, if you could come in with pre-approved financing and comes through on your offer that you don't have to worry about a contingency where financing is going to go rolled up. You've already got the financing locked. Does that actually increase the attractiveness of your bid over someone else who said, yes, I'm going to offer you 60,000 over, but only if XYZ fall in place?
Well, I wouldn't do it if you have simply been pre-qualified for a loan. You can get pre-qualified, but until you actually go through the process of completing that financing application, there's always a chance that the bank could deny
Okay.
your financing application. What I would do, however, is uh, if you could borrow, let's say you could take a cash out refinance against a property that you already own, and you take out that cash out refinance first, that loan is granted. You now have $300,000 sitting in a checking account. Great. At that point, then technically it would be a quote unquote cash offer, meaning, you've got the money in the bank. You can send them a screenshot of your checking account, so you don't have to have a financing contingency anymore.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Back to you. Just a few thoughts here and there.
No, but you are correct um, in that a person can compete on their offer price, and a person can also compete on contingencies. And so, if there's a certain maximum offer price that you don't want to go above, then the other place where you can be competitive are in the contingencies that you put into the contract. I would not recommend waiving a financing contingency unless you literally do have money sitting around in a checking account, whether it's money that you've saved or whether it comes from a cash out refi. I don't care where it came from, but unless you literally do have that money on hand, don't waive the financing contingency. What you could do, if you're able to do so, is you could waive your home sale contingency. So a lot of buyers who are current homeowners will put what's called a home sale contingency in the contract, meaning that they say that they will only buy a given home if they can sell their current home. And that, of course, presents another opportunity for the contract to blow up. So if you have the ability to maybe for a few months pay two mortgages simultaneously, move in, close on that house that you're buying and move in while you're waiting for your current house to sell, great. If you can swing that, then you can waive your home sale contingency, have those two matters be separate, and now you've got an offer that's a little bit stronger than the people who do throw that contingency in there.
That's exactly what my wife and I did. And that's kind of where I was going with that, although you helped me get to the actual action step that we took. So I know that was something that the seller looked at our offer more seriously because they said, this is a lock. This is not going to fall out. And having been on the other side where I had an offer fall out, I can tell you, after you've gone through that, you really, if you go this far, do not want to have to start over with somebody else.
Right. I
Yeah.
mean, that's ultimately what you're doing here, right? You're lowering the risk for the seller by as many of these contingencies as you waive. And also, I assume, Paula, like the percentage cash you put down. Obviously, 100% cash is the least risk, but as you put more cash down, that lessens their risk, however large or small that may be. But it's just risk mitigation as far as like if I'm putting myself in the mind of the seller, that's what I'm looking to benefit from here.
Exactly, exactly. A higher earnest money deposit is another way that you can mitigate risk for the seller and also signal your seriousness. When I was making offers on properties in early 2021, this was in I think February 2021, I went under contract on a particular duplex that I ended up not closing on. So I went under contract on it sight unseen and then flew out to Indianapolis to look at it. And walked through it during that visit with a couple of contractors and got some estimates on what it would cost to get it rent ready. And those estimates came out at about $40,000 more than what I had estimated. And so I went back to the seller and I said, look, I will present you. I was still within my buyer's general right to terminate period. So I had the ability to cancel the contract at that time for any reason. And so I went back to the seller and I said, hey, I'll give you two choices. Either you lower the price that we agreed on by $40,000. And if you do so, I will guarantee you that I will close this deal, or you don't, and I'm going to terminate the contract. And in order to signal my seriousness that, that I wasn't going to pull any more hijinks on them, I really would close the deal. I would say, I said, if you lower the price that we agreed on by $40,000, I will increase my earnest money to $100,000.
Yeah.
So
that's brilliant.
it was a way of signaling like, I'm really effing serious. I'm definitely closing on this.
And Paula, for the audience, could you define earnest money just in case someone has never heard of that before?
Sure. Yeah. When you make an offer on a property, you put down what's referred to as earnest money. This is money that's held in escrow, meaning it's held by a third party. And it can be as small as $1,000. It can be maybe 1% of the price of the home. It can be whatever amount you offer it to be. But this is money that you put down so that if you terminate the contract outside of the scope of the agreement, right? Like when you write a contract, you're essentially entering into a legally binding agreement between buyer and seller in which the buyer says, I will purchase the property as long as these certain contingencies are met, right? But technically, no one can force you to actually go through with a deal. I mean, if all of the contingencies are met and you decide not to go through with the deal, what's the seller going to do? Throw you in jail? They like, how are they going to enforce the contract, right? They would have to sue you, and that would be very time consuming, and nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to go to small claims court. And so instead, the real estate system developed this thing that's called earnest money, where you put down a certain amount of money, and if you break the contract outside of the way that the contract specifies you are allowed to break it, then the seller can keep your earnest money. So it's a way that the seller can collect what is essentially a penalty from you, a penalty payment, if you break the contract outside of the designated ways.
That's amazing. So that $100,000 that you put down, I mean, that shows you're as serious as humanly possible, right? Like there's no world where you're walking away. So, right, this is not me just saying, oh, let's take 40,000 off, and who knows what's going to be the next ask. This is
Exactly.
just real clear. So yeah, that's very cool. Everything we can add to the toolbox of people in these negotiations is really important. So maybe like, for most people who are buying their own home, single family home, instead of, hey, the real estate agent said, oh, maybe you should put 2,000 earnest money. Like, is there a thought to maybe you should raise that to 5, 10, 50? Like, is there any advice, or is that a no-go basically on a regular residence? What would your advice be?
I mean, unless it's going to be a jaw-dropping amount, I don't think that it's going to make a big difference. So, I think if you're an example like the one I just gave, where I was already under contract on a property and I was renegotiating during the due diligence period, in an example like that, increasing my earnest money was a way of signaling, that I was serious about this renegotiation. But if you're just making an initial offer, yeah, I don't personally, and ask your agent, of course. But I don't personally see a big difference between 5,000 versus 10,000. I don't think it's gonna really sway the seller one way or the other in most cases.
All right. So Paula, are there more contingencies?
Yes, absolutely. So far we have talked about the financing contingency and we've talked about the home sale contingency. There is also what's referred to as an inspection contingency. And I never, ever, ever, ever. I want everyone who's listening, who's not driving right now, to raise your right hand and repeat after me. I will never, ever, ever waive the inspection contingency. All right, repeat after me.
I so pledge.
Excellent.
No, let's talk about this for a second. I mean, this is really important because people are starting to feel like if they can't compete on price, maybe they can compete on it's a sneaky little idea that's like the house looks pretty new. It's in a good neighborhood. I've lost 10 offers.
How bad could it be, right?
I can fix it. There's YouTube. Like maybe I could compete on a lower bar.
Yeah, no. Terrible, terrible idea. Now, I do want to make the distinction that there's a difference between waiving the inspection versus buying a home as is. So when I competed for the duplex in Indianapolis that I did end up buying, and I closed in March, I bought the home as is, but I still had an inspection. So let's talk about the difference between the two. If you waive your inspection, you literally do not know what you're getting. You do not have a licensed inspector going out there and giving you a report, and you do not have the ability to look at that report and make a final decision about whether or not you want that property based on the inspector's report. And that is a risk that I don't think anyone should ever take. I don't care if the house was built in 2020. Like, no matter what,
2020 was kind of a squirrely year. So, I mean,
Yeah.
that wouldn't be a write-off for me.
Exactly. I don't care if you're buying, I'm trying to think of a famous house. I don't care if you're
The
buying
Home
the best
Alone
house
house
in the
was
city.
on the market relatively recently. I saw that pop out, but we know some interesting stuff happened there as well. So I'd still get a home inspection. Macaulay Culkin.
So
Yeah,
Paula, I actually had a friend who's in this situation, and he was very strongly contemplating, waiving that inspection. And his argument was, oh, how bad could it be? Assuming that it's not foundation or there's not mold or something, which, I'm sure
Those
you
are
have
the
a
big ones,
strong,
right?
strong
Oil
rebuttal to.
tanker, foundation issues, and mold, termites. There's probably a couple more, but there's some scary
Yeah, I'm
stuff
sure
out
there's
there.
a lot, but this is how he was trying to
Jobbins
justify it.
wiring. Yeah.
Right. And how bad could it be? And I guess your response would be,
It would be exactly, how bad could it be? Only an inspection can tell you that. Like,
You'll
if
never
you were to
know
ask that
until
question
it's
literally.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Now, and again, I do want to make the distinction. It's perfectly fine to put in to enter into your contract that you're buying the home as is. And what that means is that you are waiving your right, essentially, this is sort of a simplified way of explaining it, but in a very simplistic sense, you are waiving your right to ask the seller to make any repairs. So you go under contract for a property, you have an inspection done, and let's say the inspection comes back and it shows that there are a bunch of damaged shingles on the roof and the hot water heater is broken and the wooden deck is not actually attached to the
Well, basically, suddenly
exterior
you're
of the house.
presented with a $40,000 bill. To get it back to baseline, the inspection's coming back with $40,000 of stuff.
Correct. All right. So let's say the inspection comes back and that's what it shows. If you buy the home as is, if that's the agreement, then what you are pledging is that you will not go to the seller during that due diligence period and say, hey, dear seller, I would like you to make these fixes or I would like you to give me a credit for these fixes. You will not go to the seller and ask for anything. You will instead take a look at that inspection report, and then you will make a decision as to whether or not you still want the property. And if you want the property, knowing that there are $40,000 worth of repairs, cool. You're going in with your eyes wide open. You have that knowledge, but you're not asking the seller for anything. You're buying it as is. So the seller's not going to make any repairs for you. The seller's not going to give you a credit, and you're not even going to ask. That's what that means.
Okay, that's huge. So you're not waiving the inspection. So you still have the right to go or no go on the entire deal.
Correct.
But if you say yes, we're moving forward, it's as is, the seller pays $0 and you're going in with eyes wide open, but you still have that decision point to say, okay, no, we're going to cancel. I lose my earnest money and whatever else, right? Like, but minor items. Or is that true? First off,
You actually wouldn't lose your earnest money as
Really?
long as you're still in the inspection period. Yeah.
Okay. So then, right. But you still have that option to pull out based on the contingency of the inspection. Okay, that's a huge distinction for people.
Yes, exactly. So again, when I bought that duplex in March, I I made the offer as is. And what that, in terms of risk mitigation for the seller, what that signal to the seller is that I'm not going to come back and try to renegotiate with them.
Didn't you renegotiate?
That was a different home.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So the home that I didn't buy,
Yeah.
that one I renegotiated. And I said, "Hey, seller, here are my two offers. Here's my renegotiation."
Gotcha.
And so then that deal fell apart. I went back to the drawing board. And so the second home that I went under contract for, that was the one that I ended up buying. And so the home that I actually ended up buying, which is not the home that I renegotiated, the home that I ended up buying, I waived my ability to renegotiate.
Okay.
So it reassured the seller that I'm not going to come back with a list of additional demands. Once we go under contract, this contract is either going to close or it's not. So it's more peace of mind for the seller.
All right. Any more contingencies?
Yes. So there's one that's called the buyer's general right to terminate. This is more common in some states, less common in other states. But a buyer's general right to terminate is a blank check that says that during this particular window of time, you can terminate the contract for absolutely any reason or no reason at all. And so it's distinct from an inspection clause because it doesn't technically reference an inspection. It's like, hey, if I stub my big toe, I can arbitrarily decide to terminate the contract. I have complete carte blanche to terminate this contract if I want to for any reason.
So if you're in particular states that have this weird and somewhat arbitrary extra get out of jail free card, you could waive that as a sign of confidence to the seller that you're here for reals.
Correct. And technically you can ask for that in any state. It's just that in some places it's more common and in some places it's less common.
Yeah, but by asking for it, you're doing the exact opposite of what we want, which is you're weakening, like you're protecting
Correct.
yourself as a buyer, but to the seller is like, oh, I don't normally see this. And this person out of my 30 offers says they would like to be able to get out of a contract that they just extended to me at any time and even any reason, even though they just offered me an extra 10K. Let's put that one to the side and focus on the other 27 that we're looking at right here. So
Exactly.
it would be more of a verbal thing where you would want to, because a lot of this, when you're dealing in a situation where you have a real estate agent interacting with another real estate agent, they are conveying or selling you as a buyer to the seller agent. And they are conveying what may not be conveyed necessarily just on the offer, like, and little things like, hey, they want to remove this silly little stub my toe, get out of jail free card from this. They also want to put up extra earnest money. They also want to buy as is. These are also, in many cases, communicated via conversation from one agent to another to let the agent know, look, my client is solid. These other people, these other 27 candidates, super sketchy. They probably all have had multiple offers that have all probably fallen through. My guy or gal, they are 100%. Like you'd be lucky to get to the finish line with them because it'd be a lock.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, waiving the general right to terminate, I think is as long as you keep the inspection,
Yeah.
I think it's perfectly fine to not have a general right to terminate. And then the last one is the appraisal contingency. So I waived my appraisal contingency. My parents, of course, they were buying in cash, so they also didn't have one. If you can waive the appraisal contingency, that will also make the offer stronger. What it means is that if the bank appraises the property and it doesn't appraise for the amount that you agreed to close on, then it's up to you to come up with that cash difference. So I think it's perfectly fine to waive the appraisal contingency as long as you have the cash to be able to bridge any gap if a gap were to appear.
Right. Paul, I'm glad you came around to this because, this is what I started off this whole conversation with, right? Is about, hey, things are moving quickly. They might not appraise. Can you talk us through like a super simple, like round numbers type example of, hey, you're buying a house for whatever numbers work well in your mind, 400,000. It appraises for 350. You're going to put down X percent. Talk us through like a real simple example, because I think that isn't necessarily intuitive to people of like, hey, if this happens, I need to come up with all this other cash and bring it to the table. Is there any way you can do like a simple example?
Yeah, absolutely. So sure, you and the seller agree to transact a house at $400,000. The house appraises at $300,000, let's say, you have a down payment of uh, 50,000, and the bank will lend you, X amount, and you have to come up with the difference between what the bank will lend and that total amount. So
So
in this
could I interrupt super quick? So the X amount, because I think that's actually the part that people get confused on. So it appraised at 300. What would the bank generate in very broad terms? I know you can't give a
So
specific answer,
yeah,
but in
it
broad
depends.
terms.
It depends on the type of loan that you're getting, because if you have, let's say, an FHA loan, you can put as little as 3.5% down. Whereas if you're taking out a uh, conventional institutional loan, then the bank might require 20% down or 10% down. So it very much, the
Right.
down payment is going to depend on the type of loan that you're getting.
Okay, but just using those back of the envelope. So 300,000 appraised, let's say it was 20%, then the most they'll give you is 240. If it was 10%, they'll give you a mortgage of 270. If it's
Mhm.
FHA, it'd be about 290-ish plus or minus. But like we said, the contracted price is 400 in that
400.
case, right? So
Exactly.
if you had to put 20% down on, or let me rephrase, if you could only get 80% of the appraised amount from the bank in mortgage, that's 240,000 as your mortgage, and you have to come up with that difference of $160,000, right, between your mortgage and the contracted price. So I
Mhm.
mean that's a massive amount. Like you said, this person might have 50,000 down. So is that an accurate understanding? And B,
Mhm.
like what advice would you give in a situation like that?
Right.
And to hear the advice, let me just add on to what Brad just said there, because the exact scenario we've been setting up is that this is happening all the time. Paul, about 15 minutes ago, you referenced how appraisers have it really tough right now. You wouldn't want to be in that situation. You have that individual that was like, to get this house, I've got to offer 45 more than asking. You were saying, well, the asking is what the market is, but there's a space between what the appraiser values it at, what the bank values it at, because of what the appraiser said, what the loan will give you, and then what you just offered. And if you went a little bit too Rambo, then
That's a great expression.
you're going to end up in you could end up in the exact scenario that Brad laid out. Whereas any other year, that might not, things are more aligned. But this year, you could be in a scenario where there is a $60,000 space between what the appraisal came back at and what you offered. This is a very, very plausible
Mhm.
scenario that is potentially happening to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of potential buyers.
Mhm. Exactly, exactly. In fact, it gets even worse, because some banks are so concerned about lumber prices, going back to our earlier conversation about lumber, that is starting to get factored into, the way that appraisers make decisions, and the way that, the estimates that banks will use if, you know, if a home, like, let's say a home needs a 203K loan, which is a repair loan, that also then starts getting factored into it. So, yes, this is a huge challenge for people. Now, the good news for buyers is that if you do have an appraisal contingency, then what that means is that if the home does not appraise, then you don't have to go, if it does not appraise at the contracted price, then you do not have to go through with the purchase. So an appraisal contingency protects the buyer, but if you choose to waive your appraisal contingency, then you choose to waive that protection. So choosing to waive an appraisal contingency is the type of thing you should only do if you have the cash to be able to swing it. That being said, if your first appraisal comes back and it does not appraise, you can challenge that appraisal. So you can ask to get a second appraisal done. And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, if you do get a second appraisal done, a lot of buyers anecdotally have reported that that second appraisal ends up coming out in their favor a little bit more, but that's a risk that you take.
Well, to add some flavor to that, the appraiser the first time is going in blind, and the second
Mhm,
appraiser is usually aware that they are being brought in as the second appraisal. It's
mhm,
just it's just human nature. I'm not going to read much more into that, but you just said anecdotally it turns out that the second appraisal is usually a little bit closer to what was needed the first time. And that appraiser probably has more information than they did the first time going in. So just a point to consider if someone were to need it, but probably if the house is the one, and in your big case is there's not the one house, keep looking. Don't waive the inspection report, people. But this is a tool to have in your toolkit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, Paula, I want to ask just a total off the wall question, but I think this might be applicable to a lot of people listening. As you know, we're always about this actionable advice, right? So even for people who aren't in the market for a new house, something you said in there just brought up a question. So rising lumber costs, right? Rising replacement cost.
Mm-hmm.
Homeowners insurance. Are many of us now potentially underinsured on our homeowners policies for our, just my house, for instance, right? Like if I have a policy for X amount, but now the replacement cost is dramatically higher, 2 or 3x, is this something I should start looking into?
That's a really good question. That actually did not occur to me, and I have never heard any discussion of this. So you heard it here first on the Choose
Bonus
FI
points.
podcast.
Bonus points.
Cool. All right. Well, we will look into that then. Right?
That's an excellent question.
You should probably contact your state or county and see if they are charging you enough in taxes too, based on the lumber costs. Well, like, are you guys sure? It's this house. The equity on Zillow has gone up a lot.
Brad, my answer to that would be that that's going to depend on your assumptions for how long lumber prices will stay high.
Okay.
Not just lumber, but also copper and steel. But lumber, of course, is the biggest component of a home, of a lot of home repair and replacement. If you assume that capacity will start to catch up with demand in the next quarter or in the next 2 quarters, then all right, you might not be underinsured. I mean, or you might temporarily be underinsured, but everything will be fine by year's end.
Sure.
If you assume that these high lumber prices are, if not a permanent condition, at least a condition that will last for the next several years, then that would be a greater cause for concern. To go back to why lumber capacity cannot meet demand, I mean, the factors that are at play here, as we alluded to at the beginning of this, are very multifaceted. In part, it's that, as I mentioned earlier, it is both labor capacity and mechanical capacity. It's very hard to scale up mechanical capacity. It's very hard to open a lumber mill. There's also the other side of that. There's labor capacity. And right now, basically every lumber mill is hiring, and they are finding it very, very difficult to fill those positions. Even raising what they're paying people and offering lots of incentives for hiring, lots of incentives for new employees, they're finding it very difficult to fill those job openings. So in addition to, in addition to lack of being able to onboard more mechanical capacity, there's also challenges in the labor market right now that might not exist in the next 6 months that could help mill owners fill some of those job openings. On top of that, imports like imports of lumber that we get, right now we're not really getting that. We used to get a lot more lumber imported from Europe, and there's quite a bit of lumber trade between the U.S. and Canada. Right now, none of that is happening as well, and partly that's because housing demand has spiked not just in the U.S. but worldwide. Partly those are like supply shortages worldwide due to COVID. So a lot of it is when will the upstream supply chain, not just here, but globally, when will it be able to catch up? And when will we be able to start getting imports again? I mean, all of those are going to play into how long lumber is going to stay expensive.
So I watched the Big Short probably a couple months ago. Probably, I wonder if anybody else watched it relatively recently. But I mean, as we were looking at what's going on in the housing market, it's a wonderful. The book's great and the movie's great as well. And I know a lot of people, and we even started this episode talking about, are there comparisons, and you push back on that. And so when we talk about why are we here, it was actually a big surprise to me when you said, we are not experiencing a housing surplus. We are experiencing a housing shortage. That was just not the framework that I came into this conversation with. And we've talked about a couple of factors: the cost of lumber, some labor issues in the market. We talked about supply chain issues. Um, and I was even thinking, maybe there's a few things that we could even pull. And to be honest with you, one of the reasons that in my mind, I kind of had this idea of where this might be going is we all know we're coming out of a rough year. 2020 was a rough year. We're dealing with a global pandemic. There's many industries that have been overturned, decimated, weakened, slowed down, et cetera. I mean, you were talking about the lumber mills having trouble filling. There's a lot of industries that they're not having trouble. They've just decimated their workforce. At this particular, and maybe they are reopening at some point, but it doesn't just get turned on like that. There's a
Mhm.
process and a switch. So in my mind, although there's many industries that are thriving, there's many more like hospitality, travel, et cetera, where individuals were in these exact homes. And it doesn't seem like the homes that were at the price that they could have afforded a year or two ago are still there. So I'm surprised to see not just us holding the line, but actually unprecedented over the last decade levels of demand. But even at a couple, I was trying to think through, well, what are we seeing here? And a couple things came to mind. Maybe to some degree, maybe there's some sort of like exodus from the cities. Remote work is becoming much more plausible. And so many people that were moving as close to their job in the city as possible are now moving out to suburbia or moving a little bit farther out. And so you're seeing that sort of exodus. Many people now working from home are looking for a home office. So maybe that, 2 room or 1 room, whatever that setup that they had before is no longer works for what. So there's just a mass pivot and shift. These were all just kind of different factors
Mhm.
that I was weighing out. But I'll be honest with you, everything that we've talked about up to this point does not make me suddenly feel like these prices are going to go down tomorrow. But we also know they just can't keep going up. It's by definition unsustainable. So some softening, to your point, some new price has to be
Mhm.
hit. And the final thing that I would just add on to this, and I don't know if there's a question here, it's just all my little like observations kind of coming together, is that fundamental sea changes in the way that our world operates are happening right now. I saw a Wall Street Journal article. I pulled it up just because it popped up on my feed this morning, and it said, if you sell a house these days, the buyer might be a pension fund. And so, and actually, I think in there it's actually referencing BlackRock and Fundrise. So BlackRock is a major investor in Fundrise, and they're talking about how like large pension firms are actually picking up, are investing in Fundrise, and they're purchasing a bunch of houses. And so, while I don't know, I can obviously that you can't attribute this rise in prices to something like that. There are a lot of things that we have just frankly never seen before that are all happening at once, and pinning down what are the variables that are driving this? What's the 80/20 of this? This seems really tough for me.
Mhm. Well, so to what you said, that more people there's an exodus from the cities, more people are moving out to the suburbs. If you're working from home, you may want more space, you want a backyard, you want a home office. Those are all true, and those are all factors that started in 2020. But I think that one thing that's important to remember as we talk about what's happening with the housing market right now is that we are seeing the acceleration of a trend that started as early as 2010. So from 2010 through 2020, for that decade, the supply of housing was steadily declining. And it got to the point where in February of 2020, the government sponsored entity Freddie Mac stated, and I quote, the United States suffers from a severe housing shortage. That's a direct
Mm.
quote. And they called it, quote, a major challenge. And they estimated that 2.5 million new housing units would be needed to bridge the gap between supply and demand. Now, that was February of 2020. That was pre pandemic. Um, and they attributed a handful of factors to that. Partially, it's that the cost per square foot of new construction is prohibitively expensive in many areas, particularly high cost of living cities where the underlying land value is already high. And so that squeezes margins so tight that builders decide that it's just not worthwhile. Partially, it is population growth and specifically new household formation inside of population growth. And so um, like all of these factors, that decline in new construction that started a decade ago, over a decade ago. And the pandemic accelerated in the same way that remote work has been a trend for, ever since the invention of the internet and the popularization of the internet. Remote work has been around since 2008, 2009. It just accelerated in the last year. And similarly, this decline in housing supply, this is a trend that's been around since 2010. It just accelerated in the last year.
Yeah, that is fascinating. So this is truly economics 101, right? This is supply and demand at its essence. And like you said, this is not an overnight thing. This is now 11 years in the making. And if we are millions of houses short in the supply of what we need, it doesn't seem unsustainable that prices are rising. I think, we're not used to seeing them rise this quickly, but like you said, everything has been accelerated. So yeah, that is Jonathan, like you said, you come in with a preconceived notion and then you have an expert on, and we're both illuminated. This is fantastic.
Well, to be honest, I'm a little conflicted, Brad, because now I'm thinking about individuals that I've maybe, I wouldn't say give advice to, but like talked out loud with, like
Given bad advice to.
No, I would never do that. I don't have bad advice. I don't have that. But it's kind of like just wait. Like it's not sustainable. It's going to soften. It's going to slow down. Like if you're where you are and you're feeling the pinch, I promise you a lot of other people too. It just by definition can't, it can't keep doing this. I would just, if you can, I would just wait it out. And what if BlackRock has it right and is throwing billions of dollars at every free home because they're not printing more land, and in fact, you need to get in now. If you want to get a home, you get in now. And like, you just follow the rules. I mean, is that the counterpoint now? The best thing a pension can do is throw every free dollar at real estate.
Well, there are a couple of things that, and this is all speculative, but there are a few things that might happen. First of all, it doesn't look as though supply is going to increase in any dramatic way anytime soon. But if we want supply and demand to get closer to each other, it could be that real estate reaches a point at which demand softens. And if demand softens, then supply and demand get closer to one another, not because supply has increased, but because demand has decreased. And so, one trend that we've also seen during the pandemic is that more people, young people in particular, are living at home, or you have the formation of more multi-generational households. Perhaps that trend, which also accelerated during the pandemic, maybe that will continue to accelerate. And so maybe the new household formation will decrease. The number of new household formation will decrease, and that will have an impact on softening the demand. That's one thing that certainly could happen. It could be, it might be the case that we have a lot of excess retail and commercial space, and assuming friendly municipalities that allow for rezoning, it could be that some of those commercial spaces get rezoned into residential, which would help the supply side of the equation, because then you don't have to bother with the cost of new construction. Then it's largely an issue of permitting and some minor renovations. So all of those things could happen in the future. And I agree with you, Jonathan. It very much could soften, either because we find creative ways to create new supply, like rezoning, or that just demand softens.
Or printing houses in 3D, giant printers coming to a corner near you. What about, so let's talk, so this has all been through the lens of a buyer, and we have a lot of sympathy right now for buyers. But when you go to the other side and you look at it through the lens of a seller, things are also kind of interesting in that if you are a seller selling your primary residence, you are now a buyer. So your benefits are really great on the front end, but then you're in the exact same situation as everyone else. So you can kind of, take it what you will. But the one thing that is kind of interesting is actually when you pivot outside of that and you talk about being a seller of investment properties. So what I was very actually surprised to hear in a positive way was that you were still actively finding deals that you thought you could either find or create value in, even in March of 2021. That was fantastic. And we could explore that a little bit further, but I think basically you would say my principles still apply. You got to look at it like a business. I mean, we've had a little bit of those conversations, but I wonder now if you actually take a look at it through the lens of a seller that has multiple rental properties, and some of them are duds. is this a wonderful opportunity to consolidate your portfolio? And kind of what thought process would you go through? Should you just hold on to everything because there's no such thing as bad real estate right now? Or should you look at this as a gift and say, I don't, I could just bring it down. I could simplify my portfolio and there's a lot to be gained out there.
Well, so if you are a seller who holds multiple rental properties, I think when you said that you've got a couple that are duds, I think that's the operative, like, that's the $1 million question, quite literally. Do you want to sell because a couple of your properties are duds and they're just bad investments and you want to clear your portfolio of them? Or do you have a bunch of really top performers? If it's the case that you've got some great performers, nothing is a dud, and you love everything that's in your portfolio, then you might not necessarily want to sell. I mean, it depends, of course, on your goals as an investor. Every investor is going to have different goals about how long, ideally, what's your ideal holding period? How many doors do you want to own? Would you rather have more doors with more mortgages or fewer doors and all free and clear? Every investor has their own specific investment goals that are related to their own life goals and risk tolerance. But if your portfolio doesn't fit your goals as an investor, then and you've got a couple of properties that are in there that are duds, yeah, sell the duds. But if you like the properties that you have, I'm not selling anything in my portfolio because I like everything in my portfolio. And if I wanted to take advantage of the fact that prices are climbing so much, the way that I personally would do that would be to borrow against the now much higher equity of the properties in my portfolio. So, given the fact that everything in my portfolio is going to appraise for quite a lot more than it did even 2 years ago, if I wanted to take advantage of this, plus advantage of the fact that we've got super low interest rates, this would be a perfect time for me to hold on to those properties because they're still good performers, borrow against it, and then use those loans to acquire more properties. But don't do it if you don't hang on to duds for the sake of hanging on.
Right. So if we have duds and an individual, and this is kind of an interesting train of thought here, we have duds, but there's that as an investment property, they're duds. As a piece of real estate, they're sitting on land, and everybody seems to want that land, including sight unseen and inspection ports foregone and all this stuff. They just want to throw it. And then it's like, great. But now it's kind of an interesting situation because you're not your primary residence and you were going to get out of real estate, but now there's some capital gains that you got to be aware of. I mean, if you have a couple $100,000 in equity with just the appreciation, now it's like your two options are roll it over 1031, right? 1031 to roll it
Yep.
over, or it's going to hit your tax returns for this year. I mean, that's basically the two options. In which case, you're going to have 200,000 of capital gains show up on your taxes. Is that accurate?
Yes. Well, I guess your third option is that you could move into it for the next 2 years and then sell it. That would be the third choice.
Get the exclusion, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you explain just super quick, Paula? I always want to make
Sure.
sure that we don't gloss past. How does that exclusion work?
Sure.
The 2 of the last 5 years, et
Two of
cetera.
exactly. If you've lived in a particular property for 2 out of the last 5 years, then a certain amount of your gains, a fairly significant amount of your gains, there is a ceiling, but it's a high ceiling. Then your gains up to a certain ceiling are exempt from capital gains tax.
Right. And last that I checked, for single taxpayers, it's 250,000. For married filing joint, it's 500,000. Does that sound roughly accurate?
That sounds roughly. I don't remember the numbers, but that sounds ballpark correct.
Yeah. So it's a massive number.
Paula
Yeah.
doesn't sell her properties, Brad. She turns them into profit. All right. Well, coming back to this, actually, Brad, I wanted to ask you about this just to run a quick calculation for me. So, like, let's say an individual has $200,000 of profit split over these 2 dud properties. They hate them. They loathe them. They recognize they can unload them right now and pull out a lot of equity and never have to deal with it again. And right now, just the idea of getting back into the market makes them very, very nervous just because it's so freaking hot right now. So they're like, I think I'm just going to use this as a temporary withdrawal, which does mean that this $200,000, and let's just assume they make, 50,000 a year, just for the purposes of not moving the numbers anywhere generally, but they have $200,000 of capital gains. How generally in the United States, how would our tax code treat that capital gains? How much generally would you, as a former accountant, just kind of mentally set aside to cover that tax bill the following year? without knowing much more about their tax situation?
Yeah, I mean, just off the top of my head, assuming that they own this for more than a year, so it would qualify for long-term capital gains treatment. And obviously, Paula, you can give some nuance here with, there's different deductions and such. But if we're just going on like just this general, after we've done the calculations, it's 200,000. The long-term cap gains rate should be 15%. So that would be 30,000 in tax. And then I guess you would assume you have a state tax as well. So I probably, living in Virginia, I would roughly estimate 20%. So for me, $40,000 is what I would assume my tax liability on that is. That is, without any further information off the top of my head. Paula, can you roughly corroborate that?
No, that sounds right to me.
Awesome. So Paul, I think one other thing we should talk on as we start to kind of wrap up here is, I mentioned very casually in passing this idea of, hey, well, the thing about land is they don't make any more land. You got what you got, right? And I think that kind of ties to maybe people's inflation fears. And at the point of this recording, I was served up a little article on Google this morning telling me that our CPI, our inflation index, came out, and for the first time in a very, very long time, it was at 5%. Now, I haven't dug into that further to see how they actually came up with that number and what that means. But if we were just to pull back and take a look I do think people generally have a fear of inflation, and rightly so. And what does that mean for us when we're talking about real estate?
Oh, so in the conversation that we've been having about why demand is so high right now, I have an untested hypothesis that one of the reasons that there is such high demand is because in a period of inflation, people who hold fixed rate debt are in an excellent position. And so given the fact that we are in an environment in which there's a very reasonable likelihood, I'm not saying it will happen, we never know the future, but there is a reasonable likelihood that we may encounter some inflation, some possibly significant inflation. At least many people are afraid of that, and I think they have good reason to be. Given those inflation fears, coupled with ultra low fixed rate mortgages, it's a perfect storm, right? If you think there's going to be inflation and you have the ability to take out a mortgage at 3%, why wouldn't you?
Are you in a rush to pay down your mortgage? Conversely, I mean, it's the exact same conversation, but if you have a 2% loan and you're thinking, I feel like there's some inflation coming, are you in a rush to take your dollars now and pay off your mortgage early?
No, I've actually had that thought recently I can never certainly forecast what inflation is going to be or if hyperinflation is coming or whatever other things people are talking about. But, in that regard, yeah, I mean, I'm in no rush whatsoever to pay off my mortgage because 5 years from now, who the heck knows, my $200,000 mortgage might be a tiny, tiny little pittance, right? So this is something that, obviously you can tell I haven't put much thought into, but it did flitter across my mind as, oh, that's actually maybe changing the calculus of, do I put additional principal now towards my mortgage when my mortgage interest rate is 2.5% or whatever?
Because in contrast, Paula, to hand this back to you, when you have a fixed rate mortgage, like you can bank that your mortgage payment is going to be this exact amount month over month, no matter what happens. If you get a raise, whatever, if inflation happens and all your money grows in value and goes up with that, your mortgage is fixed. If you were renting right now, you would expect that when your lease is up, your landlord is going to look at the scene, look at what's going on around them and say, well, based on current market rates and inflation, if that's the case, we're gonna increase rents by some percentage. I mean, that would just be a case. And so if you can just lock that in, that would make sense to many people running that Brad internal calculus.
Exactly. And I have that untested hypothesis that part of the reason why demand is so high right now is because many people are running exactly the internal calculus that you just described. And what's interesting is that in periods where there are inflationary fears, assets that are good assets to hold during an inflationary time tend to go up regardless of whether or not that inflation ever comes to pass. And so real estate, and specifically being a debt holder, being a mortgage holder with a fixed rate loan, those are, real estate's a great asset to hold, and a low interest fixed rate loan is a great instrument to hold during an inflationary period. And regardless of whether or not inflation ever comes to pass, I think part of the run up of real estate prices right now is a reflection of the fears. And so the anticipation of inflation drives the market, whether or not the inflation itself actually ever happens.
And I think what is unsaid in that statement, Paula, is fixed rate versus like a variable rate. When we go look at what
Mm.
happened back in 2006, 2007, a lot of people qualified for homes using a variable payment, a variable mortgage with some sort of balloon payment at the end or some sort of adjustment into another mortgage at the end. And the reason that all these people got into these homes was that they were expecting appreciation based on what they had heard before. And they would get into the home, they could afford the variable payment, and they were expecting that they'd be able to refinance out at some point or they'd be able to sell it for profit, some extension of that. But these variable rates really caused havoc. Now, come to this point, if you're an individual right now, rates are incredibly favorable. To your exact point, at a time of uncertainty like this, you do want more certainty. And so if one of those things that you have is a variable rate that's incredibly cheap, well, this might be a great time generally to say I'd like more certainty, and when possible I'd like
Mhm.
to start looking at a fixed mortgage rate, because variable does mean variable, and variable has been very, very low for a very, very long time. But you are not guaranteed a price from year to year, and it will mirror the market.
Right. You bring up a really interesting point, which is that in 2006, people anticipated appreciation. And in 2021, people anticipate inflation.
Hmm.
And that's yet another distinction between the housing market then and now.
Oh, appreciation versus inflation. Yeah, yeah, you're right. I would have bundled those together as a comparison, and you would have properly separated them into separate buckets. So I would like to go back to what we said at the beginning of this episode: is a housing market crash incoming? And say we don't know, but what we do know is that what we're experiencing right now is as far apart from what we experienced in 2006, 2007 as could possibly be imagined. It doesn't mean that like everything's great or that everything's bad, but it means that it's fundamentally different than what we experienced before. And so, in light of that, since we can't predict the future and we don't know exactly what's coming, we need to understand the rules of the game as they are today. And Paula, I think you did a wonderful job helping us figure out how to take decisive steps in an uncertain future.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I'm glad that this was helpful. This was an excellent discussion.
Thank you very much for joining us. All right, everyone, if you enjoyed this, I just wanted to let you know that I'm going to be joining Paula next week for a live webinar. And we are going to be discussing, we're going to be building on a conversation we actually had on her show, talking about specifically this new world that we're moving into with regards to education. And we're taking a look at certificates versus degrees and really just kind of looking at this Venn diagram of options that we have. Because again, as we were just talking about, the world's changing. It's changing really fast. If you can stay just a little bit in front of the curve, you can profit massively. So Paula, if people are interested in joining us for that webinar, how can they find out more information?
Absolutely. Well, it is next week, as you said, it is Monday, June 28th at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. And it's you and me, Jonathan. We're going to be together live, virtual live event. And we'll be, as you just said, we'll be talking about how to build your skills, how to earn more outside of needing to go back to school or needing to go to grad school and getting buried in a bunch of student debt, because student debt is a fixed rate debt, but it's not the kind that you necessarily want.
You got to borrow extra if you want the variable. That's the key. Win them all. It's the
Exactly.
words. I get super passionate about this, and it is a topic that needs this type of exposure, because there have never been more options to build an amazing life for yourself outside of the traditional path that all of us have followed for the last 20, 30 years than there are right now.
And what you and I are going to be talking about, not to give it away, Jonathan, but we're going to be discussing how to make more money, how to up level the income side of your game without having to go the side hustle route or the entrepreneurship route. That route is great. It's wonderful for many people. I mean, you and I are both entrepreneurs, but it's not for everyone. And sometimes the other non side hustle, non entrepreneur ways to make more money get glossed over. And so we're going to make sure that we spend a lot of time talking about that.
So, Paula, virtual live event, June the 28th, 8 p.m. Eastern. How do people sign up?
affordanything.com/career.
Awesome.
Paula, thanks so much for being here. This is amazing.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show.
All right, my friends. Hope you got value from today's episode. Definitely share it with a friend. If you know someone that's feeling that housing market angst, I think they will find value here. Subscribe if you haven't already. And we'll see you next time as we continue to go down the road less traveled.
Jonathan, you and I are going to be hanging out really soon virtually, and it's live. It's a party. Our communities are invited, and we are going to be talking about an issue that is really important to both of us. And it's an issue that does not get discussed enough. I think that we are both, or certainly I'm speaking for myself, I am guilty of not having talked about this as much as I should have, given how many people it affects. So, Jonathan, why don't you explain what we're going to be chatting about when we hang out live?
We're going to be talking about earning more, but this is the whole problem. Both of us have created content in the personal finance space for, well over 5 years now. In your case, closer to 10, acknowledged. And if you were to look around the personal finance space, we know that ultimately the equation of life is it's what you earn minus what you spend is equal to this difference of the gap. And the personal finance space is really, really good at helping you spend less and really, really good at helping you figure out how to invest. But when it comes to earn more, to be honest with you, it kind of gets a little bit cliche, right? Like it's almost like a caricature, and some are better than others. There's really good options like real estate, and there's really good options like entrepreneurship. But then sometimes these just become caricatures. Like, let me show you how to start a business by how to start a blog.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And gig economy, in terms of side hustles, yeah, gig economy is a race to the bottom, and beyond that, side hustles, blah blah blah. I mean, they're great. You and I are both entrepreneurs. We both run our own businesses. So we're not saying anything bad about entrepreneurship. We are entrepreneurs ourselves, but we also know, having talked about this to our communities for years, that it's not for everybody. Some people are interested in it and some people are not. And there's a whole, there are thousands, tens of thousands of people in our communities who are not interested in entrepreneurship, and they deserve to learn how they can make more money, how they can grow the gap, how they can focus on the income side of that grow the gap equation.
So let me just quickly give you the other options that aren't really encompassing that, and they're all very, they're pretty decent. The other one is, here's how you can interview better. Here's how you can negotiate for raises. These are kind of the other two options that you have. Or here's how you can go back to college and retrain into get another degree that will give you access to different types of jobs. I think the learn how to negotiate a raise is super, super powerful as a life skill. It is worth your time and energy. But I think in many cases, when you're getting a 3% or 6% raise on $15 an hour, you're still fundamentally where you were before. You're not making an above median income, right? And so if you want to get a ridiculous performance, if you want to get absolutely, if you want to double or triple your income, you're going to need to change careers. The old suggestion used to be to go back to school. And we know all of us have that pain in our gut when we think about that. Like, you're telling me I gotta go back to school. I got to take out more student loan debt. I got to try again,
For the people in our communities who are at a point right now where maybe they've got kids, and the idea of going back to school means not only that they'd be taking out student debt, but that they wouldn't be earning an income, or they'd be earning a very, very low income while they're a student. I mean, it's hard to go back to school once you have dependents, whether those are kids, whether those are aging parents, whatever it is in your life. It's very hard to go back to school when other people are relying on you for a paycheck.
Okay. So that's the backdrop. And I know it took us a long time to get there, but it's because we really want to do justice, because after creating content for more than 5 years and collectively more than 15 years in this space, there's a hole here that nobody's answered. And on this webinar, we are going to share with you clear, definitive ways that absolutely you, I don't care if you are a 17-year-old, you are a 62-year-old, if you are a Walmart employee, if you are a single mom, if you are a truck driver, if you are an Army veteran, if you're working a full-time job, if you're working 2 jobs, how you can retrain into a new skill, even if you have no background in it. And I'm not talking about a coding job. You don't need to learn a new language. How you can retrain into a new skill, and in a period of less than 6 months, come out on the other side making 60 to 80K. and you do not need to go back to college. And we're going to show you how, if you want, you can even do this for free. Literally. Like you can take the information that we're going to share with you on this webinar, and you can go and get these results yourself.
Think of what that does. I mean, 60 to 80K. Jonathan, you've heard my story. My first job out of college, I made $21,000 a year. And I am not that old. I'm not talking about 1950s dollars, right? Like I'm talking about $2005. I was making $21,000 a year. And I get people from my community calling into my podcast saying, "Hey, I make $32,000 a year. I make $35,000 a year. I'm stressed out. I am one car repair away from having a financial emergency." That is not a situation that I want people to be in. And the thing is, so much of the time, people beat themselves up by thinking that they have a spending problem when in fact they have an earning problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the big story, the big trend here is the decoupling of skills from diplomas.
Yes. Yes.
Exactly. Right? When I don't know what your parents said to you when you were growing up. In my household, it was go to college or you are going to be living under a bridge, eating cat food out of a can. Go to college or you have no future. That was the message that I heard every single day of my life.
For you, for us, growing up, in many, many cases, we were going to be the first of our family to go to college. My call to action right now for people listening to this is, what if you could be the first not to go to college? Like the first person in your family not to, and actually do better because of it. I don't mind if you went to college. I mean, it's fine. Nick, I went to college, Paul went to college. I'm just telling you right now, I'm going to make sure my son and daughter have access to this information. If they choose to ignore me and still go to college and they want that for various reasons, fine. But everyone, if you're in college, you should do this. If you graduate college and you're one of the 70% of Americans that find themselves unsatisfied with their job, you should look into this.
So if you go to affordanything.com/career, you can sign up. We will, not only will you be able to come to this live event, virtual, online live event, but also you'll get loads of information from us about, Jonathan used the word skill stack. I love that word. So you'll get loads of information about how to make yourself indispensable, how to develop skills in a way that is decoupled from diplomas, and how to earn more outside of the context of side hustles and entrepreneurship. You'll get all of that, loads and loads and loads of free information delivered to you. Plus, you sign up for our virtual live event Monday, June 28th at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific.
See you there.
It's going to be amazing. So don't forget, go to affordanything.com/career, CAREER.
Don't forget, go to affordanything.com/career. That is CAREER.